Hello everyone, my name is Ryan and this video will take you through the entire process of a little thing called breathing. In this video we will cover the basics of the respiratory and circulatory system and how they work together. The joint effort between these two systems is one of the most important, if not the most important, process in the human body. To start, I just want to familiarize you with a few of the organs that will play a large role in these systems. They're the heart, the lungs, arteries and veins, capillaries, which are located between arteries and veins, and the alveoli, which are located deep within the lungs. Now, the act of breathing may seem like a simple concept. When we inhale or breathe in, oxygen enters our lungs, and when we exhale or breathe out, carbon dioxide leaves the lungs. But there's actually much more that goes on during that process. So, oxygen usually enters the body through the nose, which is also called the nasal cavity, then proceeds down to the pharynx. The pharynx is the small tube just below the back of the mouth, which divides into two organs, the esophagus, which is a major organ in digestion, and the trachea, which is more commonly called the windpipe. Once oxygen enters the trachea, it passes through the vocal cords, which is also known as the larynx. The trachea dives down into the chest and breaks off into two primary bronchi, one for the left lung, one for the right lung. The right lung consists of 3 lobes, while the left only has 2 due to the lack of space created by the heart. So the primary bronchi enters the lungs and further divide into the secondary bronchi, 2 for the left, 3 for the right, 1 for each lobe. The secondary bronchi then break down into what's called the tertiary bronchi. The tertiary bronchi then become bronchioles. The major difference between these tertiary bronchi and the bronchioles is the presence of supportive cartilaginous rings surrounding all the bronchi. Bronchioles do not have these cartilaginous rings around them. So the bronchioles break up into 50 to 80 terminal bronchioles, which then divide into several respiratory bronchioles. In the respiratory bronchioles, there are several alveolar ducts, which become alveolar sacs, which ultimately end with a single alveoli. So, let's do a quick recap. It goes from the nasal cavity to the pharynx. Following the pharynx is the larynx and trachea. After the trachea is the bronchi, 2 primary, which turn into the secondary and tertiary. After the bronchi come the 2 types of bronchioles, the terminal, then respiratory. The respiratory lead into the alveolar ducts, and then the alveolar sacs, which result in a single alveoli. Now, we all breathe regularly without thinking about it, but what actually causes us to breathe? The actual act of inhaling is termed inspiration, while exhaling is called expiration. When these are combined in normal breathing, it results in one quote-unquote turn of the respiratory cycle. The respiratory cycle occurs primarily due to the pressure difference between the air outside the body and the air in the lungs. Air will always move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. You see this with many things in the body. An example is sodium. The concentration of stuff will always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So, therefore, when the pressure in the air is greater than the pressure in our lungs, inspiration occurs and oxygen rushes into our lungs. Expiration occurs when the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure in the air we breathe. So oxygen flows, or carbon dioxide in this case, goes out. The pressure changes in the lungs are due to our chest expanding. The lungs are attached to the rib cage via the parietal pleural, so when the rib cage expands due to muscular contraction, the lungs also expand. This decreases the pressure in the lungs while increasing the volume. And since the pressure in the lungs is now less than the pressure in the atmosphere, air goes into our lungs. Surprisingly, only 21% of the air we breathe is oxygen. 78% of it is nitrogen, which does nothing for us in the air. 0.5% is water vapor, and the tiny amount left over is carbon dioxide. Now, the 2 main muscles that cause this expansion of the rib cage are the external intercostals, which elevate the ribs, and the diaphragm, which descends down and increases the depth of the thoracic cavity. So what these do is when the rib cage expands, it increases the volume, which decreases pressure. So the pressure in the lungs is less than the pressure in the atmosphere, so air rushes in. Going on, during normal resting breathing, the relaxation of these two muscles will cause expiration, or us to exhale. However, during hard, forced expiration, like blowing out a candle, the two main muscles that decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity are the internal, not to be confused with the external, internal intercostals, which depress the ribs, and the diaphragm, which now ascends upward to reduce the depth of the thoracic cavity. The unconscious control of these muscles for normal breathing is located in the medulla oblongata, the most inferior portion of the brain stem. However, in controlled breathing, like with singing and speaking or reciting this presentation, the signals originate in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. So now that we have air in our lungs, it's time to absorb it into the bloodstream. But before we do that, we have to first do a little breakdown of the organs of the circulatory system. There are 4 organs of the circulatory system that we'll concern ourselves with for the purpose of this video. First are the arteries, which carry blood away from the heart. Second are veins, which carry blood back to the heart. Third are the capillaries, which are between the arteries and veins and are the site of gas exchange in the tissue. Last is the heart and its 4 chambers. The 4 chambers being the left and right ventricles, which pump blood out of the heart into the arteries, and the left and right atrium, which act as a filling station on top of the ventricles, which receive blood from the veins. These different chambers are separated by 4 valves, which are broken down into 2 different types. There are 2 AV valves and 2 semilunar valves. The AV valves are the tricuspid valve, which separates the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the bicuspid, which separates the left atrium and the left ventricle. And the 2 semilunar valves, which are named after the 2 half-moon flaps of the valve, are the pulmonary and the aortic valves, which separate the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk and the left ventricle from the aorta. So, within the system of pumping blood, there are 2 kind of subsystems that we need to know. They're the pulmonary system and the systemic system. The pulmonary system consists of blood being pumped from the heart to the lungs, then back to the heart. The pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that do not carry oxygenated blood, while conversely, the pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood. A lot of people like to think that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood, but this is not the case. So moving on, the systemic system is the series of arteries and veins throughout the entire rest of the body. And it's, tissue that it works with. So oxygen travels through the respiratory membrane from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Once in the capillaries, and therefore the circulatory system, the 4 oxygen molecules can attach to 1 red blood cell, or erythrocyte, by binding to the protein hemoglobin, and it's thus called oxyhemoglobin. However, in the event of an increase in body temperature or a decrease in blood pH, such as with acute exercise or a high fever, oxygen's ability to bind to hemoglobin decreases. From the pulmonary capillaries, the blood travels through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium of the heart, which passes through the bicuspid valve and fills up the left ventricle. It's the left ventricle's duty to pump the blood from the heart to the entire rest of the body. The muscular wall, or what's called the myocardium, of the left ventricle is quite thick due to the massive force required to pump blood to the entire body. The chamber of the heart contracts as a result of the internal pacemaker, which is located in the right atrium, called the SA node. When the SA node depolarizes or starts its signal, it causes a quick contraction of the 2 atrium. At the same time, the signal reaches the AV node, which is at the center of the heart, and then travels inferiorly to the 2 AV bundle branches. The bundle branches extend all the way down to the apex of the heart, then travel to the sides and back up the wall in what's called the Purkinje fibers. As the signal reaches the end of the Purkinje fibers, the atrium then concludes filling of the ventricles. The ventricles then contract and expel blood from the heart. When the blood leaves the left ventricle, it enters the aorta. The aorta consists of 3 parts. There's the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. The ascending aorta primarily consists of the coronary arteries, which provide the blood supply for the myocardium, which, if you recall, are the muscles of the heart. You wouldn't want those to run out of blood supply, so they come first. The aortic arch gives rise to 3 more arteries. First, on the right, or as you can see in the picture, the left, the brachiocephalic trunk, which diverges into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Next in the aortic arch is the left common carotid and then the left subclavian. The common carotid arteries and the arteries that they become supply the vast majority of blood used by the brain, head, and face, while the subclavian arteries supply the blood to the shoulder, arm, forearm, hands, fingers, etc. Once it reaches that arch of the aorta and becomes the descending aorta, it dives down into the thorax and travels through the diaphragm into the abdominal cavity. There are two major arteries in the abdomen that the aorta become. One is the renal artery, which provides blood to the kidneys, and when it's in there, the kidneys are able to dictate like changes in blood pressure needed and the amount of blood that needs to be produced, etc. And the second is the celiac trunk, which provides blood supply to the liver, stomach, and spleen. All kind of important things to have good blood supply to. So once the aorta reaches the pelvic region, it breaks off into the left and right common iliac arteries. These two arteries provide blood supply for the pelvic region and then become the left and right femoral arteries. These are essentially the aorta for the thigh until it becomes the popliteal artery around the knee. Then both popliteal, the left and right, differentiate into the anterior and posterior tibial arteries, which supply blood to the lower leg and foot. At the terminal end of each artery, it becomes what's called an arteriole, which is pretty much a very tiny artery. These arterioles give rise to capillaries. In the capillaries, oxygen unbinds from hemoglobin and diffuses through the capillary wall and into its target tissue. While this is occurring at the front of the artery, carbon dioxide is entering the bloodstream at the end of the arteriole, or end of the capillary, excuse me. However, only 7% of it travels through the veins as dissolved CO2 gas. The vast majority, 70% of the carbon dioxide that leaves the tissue reacts with water in our blood plasma and becomes bicarbonate. And the last 23% binds to erythrocytes via hemoglobin and becomes what's called carbaminohemoglobin. Kind of a fun word to say, carbaminohemoglobin. Once this exchange occurs, the capillaries enter the venules, which are the smallest type of veins, and then move into our bigger veins. Thankfully and lucky for our learning, many of the major veins we have in our body mirror the major arteries that we have. In the head, the jugular vein mirrors the carotid arteries and provides drainage for deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And in the upper limbs, the left and right axillary and subclavian veins return blood to the heart. These veins dump their blood into the superior vena cava, which is basically the biggest vein in the body, and returns it back to the heart through the right atrium. In the lower leg, there are three major veins compared to the two major arteries. The veins are the anterior and posterior tibial veins, which are much like the anterior and posterior tibial arteries, and the great saphenous, which is the longest vein in the body. The great saphenous runs medially, or on the inside, along the entire lower limb until it combines with the femoral vein in the upper thigh. Like in the arterial system, the anterior and posterior tibial veins merge to become the femoral vein, which collects blood from the thigh. Like I mentioned before, the femoral vein combines with the great saphenous vein and becomes the common iliac veins. The two common iliac veins combine in the pelvic region to form the inferior vena cava, which, like the descending aorta, travels the entire abdomen and thorax until it dumps its blood into the right atrium of the heart. Once the blood enters the right atrium, the SA node causes it to contract and fill up the right ventricle. The right ventricle then expels the blood through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary trunk, which breaks into the two pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries, as a reminder, are the only two arteries that carry deoxygenated blood. The pulmonary arteries then form the alveolar capillary beds, where the carbonic waste products such as bicarbonate, carbaminohemoglobin, and that dissolved CO2 gas diffuses through the respiratory membrane into the alveoli. This process continues up until the day we die. I hope this video was helpful in your understanding of the respiratory and circulatory system. Thank you for listening, and have a fantastic day.